Everybody. It's Monday morning. Thank you very much. And we have Jon Moller, Louisiana Budget Project, uh, with us this morning. And we're going to be talking the Louisiana legislature, discuss with him what happened the last week and what we can anticipate this week. Again, if you have any questions that you want to ask, any comments you want to make, go ahead. I'll be looking for them on Facebook and Twitter. Good morning, Jon. How you doing today?
Good morning, Steve. Great to be with you.
Well, thank you so much. So, you've had a little bit of a rest, maybe a week or so almost. So, why don't you take us back in terms of what happened the last special session that really didn't end up finalizing anything except for maybe a portion of the budget.
Well, actually, I think they accomplished more than people think. First of all, they did pass a budget. The budget got passed and signed into law by Governor Edwards, not just the operating budget, but the budget for the legislature and the judiciary. They did pass some revenues, not a lot, but about $87 million in revenue. And they agreed to expand the earned income tax credit, which had been something that my organization has been working very hard and talking about for a long time. So they did give some tax relief to the working poor. What they didn't do and what they couldn't get done at the last minute and what everybody's been talking about all week is, of course, they haven't passed enough revenue to fund the things that are in the actual budget that passed. And so what we have now is a budget on Governor Edwards' desk that protects Medicaid. Medicaid is fully funded, but everything else in state government, including higher education, public safety, money for sheriffs, assistant district attorneys, higher education, top scholarships, juvenile justice, all the other things are what we're calling below the line. There's about $507 million of needs outside of healthcare that is not funded, and that's what next special session is going to be about. If they had gotten 6 more votes on a tax bill, at the minutes before midnight, then we wouldn't be coming in for a third special session. But because they were 6 votes shy of the 70 votes needed to pass a revenue bill, we're going to have to come in and do this again. But it's going to be a very focused, tight session, and there's really just one job left for the legislature to do.
So, in terms of appropriating, basically, is there any more action on appropriations?
There is not going to be a budget bill, or I'd be very sure that the call that the governor issued on Friday for the next special session is written in a way that the legislature does not get to pick and choose what they fund out of this $507 million. It's on a pro rata basis. In other words, if they raise $400 million out of 507, then 80% of the unfunded stuff gets funded, but they can't go in there and it's just kind of across the board. So that means they fund all but 20% of the unfunded portion of TOPS, for example. Higher education, sheriffs, everybody would share in those reductions, but they can't go in there and say, we're going to fund TOPS and sheriffs, but we're not going to fund food stamps and foster kids. That's off the table because of the way the call is written. So this is not going to be, and I think that's very important for people to understand. The budget discussion is over. The legislature spoke on the budget. This is about raising, how much money do they want to raise to fund the things that are currently unfunded in the budget that are below the line.
So theoretically speaking, and I know it's not going to happen, but theoretically speaking, if say the legislature raised $700 million, so I mean, what would happen with the additional money?
Well, it would be the same as any other year when the state runs a surplus. We would presumably have a surplus at some point, after this upcoming fiscal year, and it might be recognized mid-year if the money's coming in faster than expected, and so the legislature then gets to spend that next spring in a supplemental bill. I don't think anybody on any side of the aisle thinks that they're going to raise more than 507 million. They're either going to raise 507 million or they're going to raise some number below that and decide that sheriffs and tops in higher education isn't as important as maybe we think it is.
So the reason why I asked that is because, as I understood it, we were $650 million short, and that's a standstill budget. But you're saying that we've appropriated 503 million, so we're 100. Yeah.
So the governor, the budget deal that was on the table at the end of the session that they couldn't get passed on the last day was a little bit below what the governor had sought. $648 million is the difference between the forecast for this year, what they have coming in this year, and what they have next year if no extra revenue becomes available. And so they did actually make some cuts. People think that there aren't any cuts, but there's a lot of, first of all, agencies have to swallow inflation. And there are some reductions, particularly on the Medicaid side. So, we say that Medicaid is fully funded. Medicaid is actually funded a good bit below what the governor had laid out in his original executive budget. And so there's some savings in there that they think they're going to get from the utilization. They just think there's going to be less utilization of Medicaid than they had originally projected. That's where most of it's coming from. Some of it is coming on the eligibility side. They're tightening the income requirements for Medicaid, and they think there's going to be some savings there. But so that's how the number ended up closer to about 560 million, somewhere in there. And again, they did raise a little bit of money. One of two of the things they did, there was an income tax bill that deals with credit for taxes paid to other states. That's about $34 million. That passed on the last day of the session. And there's also $53 million from the BP settlement that had been going to the nursing homes and going to various trust funds. They freed that money up, and that's going to be going into the general fund. So when you add those up, it's about $87 million. Most of that is being used in the legislative and judicial budgets to fill those up. So most of that didn't go into the operating budget. But when you look at the breakdown, it's about $507 million to fund the part that is in the HB1, but is below the line. What we call most of the stuff in state government's above the line, and then there's this section of the budget that is only funded if revenues become available. And so that is the one and only job for the legislature in this third special session, is to fund the stuff that's below the line.
Gotcha. So one of the things that I've been at least getting some feedback about, specifically, I can tell you that I did a talk show on Friday with excuse me, conservative Rob Manis, and we do one every Friday, and basically, I mentioned about people would be hurt, and he is saying that really nobody's going to be hurt, although he does acknowledge tops, but he feels like that's it, and so is he wrong? I mean, I'm not trying to disagree with him or attack him. I'm just saying that it seems to me that if you're $100 million or so short, or even more, then in this case, the district attorneys, the courts, the prison, etc. I mean, they're going to have less money. They're going to be hurt.
Well, let's start with higher education. Is LSU going to close down if we don't pass these revenues? No, that's not going to happen. But $100 million cut to higher education, put aside the 30% cut to tops. There's two parts to the higher education cuts. There's a 30% cut to tops, which means we've made a promise to people who went to high school and did everything they were told to do, and we'd be breaking that promise by 30%. But then there's also $100 million in just general fund support cut to higher education if we don't pass these revenues. Louisiana has already cut state support for higher education farther and faster than any other state in the country. So we have a higher education enterprise that's already been fairly decimated. You take another $100 million out of that, you're laying off professors, you're closing departments, and you're certainly telling the best and brightest people on your faculty throughout the state that Louisiana is not the place for you. So you would be seeing thousands of people sending their resumes out to pretty much anywhere else to get the heck away from the state if we cut higher education by $100 million. And that's a decision that would have a generational impact. Our college faculty are here to train the people who are going to be leading our economy in 20, 30 years. And if you lose your best college faculty, you're not just losing a salary, you may be losing the research dollars that go with them, but you're also losing some of your best talent and the talent that you're counting on to help the next generation be the leaders and the economic engine. So I think higher education and people in higher education would tell you that they cannot take $100 million cut. Let's take another example, sheriffs. About half of all state inmates in Louisiana serve their time in local jails. And so we pay sheriffs, local sheriffs, to care for state inmates. We pay them a little bit over $25 per day per prisoner to take care of those inmates. So you have about 15, 16,000 people serving state time at the local level. And now at the state level, if you're in Angola gets about $55, $56 per prisoner per day, but those local sheriffs get less than half that. They get $25 a day. And right now, if they don't raise any money, that budget gets cut by, I think, something on the order of 20%. It gets cut. So they're already getting the lowest reimbursement of really anybody in the country, I think. I don't think there's a jail or a prison anywhere in this country that operates on $25 per day. And we're talking about cutting that. So the sheriffs are saying, we simply cannot operate if you cut the per diem for state inmates anymore. And so then we literally are looking at furloughing prisoners. Now, maybe Colonel Manus thinks it's a good idea to let 10,000 inmates out of jail, to furlough people out of prisons, because saving a half a penny of sales tax is that important to him. But I would beg to differ, and I would say that those people are in jail for a reason. We can talk about criminal justice reform, but I don't think that there's a realistic way that the sheriffs can operate on the budget that they have right now if you don't fund any more. So those are just two examples. Let's think about assistant district attorneys. Not the DAs, their salary is in the Constitution, but the assistant district attorneys, the people who do the day-to-day work of prosecuting crimes at the parish level, they're not funded in this budget. And so, and again, we're not having a budget debate. This is not, the legislature is not going to come in here and talk about, we want to spend money on this, but not that. That debate is over. The legislature spoke, and they adopted the Senate version of the budget. This is just, do you want to fund the things that are below the line? And I don't know anybody in state government who thinks that we can keep operating at a reasonable, responsible level without raising $507 million or something very, very close to that amount.
So how do we, or I should say, how do you convince those who don't believe that you're going to be hurt? How do you convince them that, hey, you're talking about, actually, are we talking about maybe prisoners actually being released? Or maybe just less money and for them? What's going to happen?
I'm an optimist. I think the legislature is going to look at their options once they kind of realize what they are and are not allowed to do in this next special session. I think they're going to get the 6 votes necessary to pass a revenue package that nobody's really going to love. Again, The sales tax is not one of those taxes. It wouldn't be my preferred way to fix the budget, but that's where we are at this point in time. I think they're going to pass a revenue package and they're going to go home and they're going to realize, because I think Republicans and Democrats both care about public safety. Republicans and Democrats both care about higher education and TOPS, and they want to keep the basic operations of, I mean, we haven't even talked about food stamps. But they all want to keep the basic operations of government going. I mean, I don't know of a single Republican who ran on the idea that we shouldn't have a food stamp program, or that we should cut another $100 million out of higher ed, or that public safety is not important. So I think they're going to get the votes. I think there are going to be some people, there are already some very angry people at the legislature, some very hard feelings about how things happened. And I'll leave the politics to others, but I really think that when the chips are down and it's time to vote, they're going to find the additional 6 votes in the House. And this is a problem in the House, not the Senate. The Senate is very clear on what they want to do. And I think you're going to find 6 members to do it. And if not, then we'll be really in uncharted waters. But I hope we don't get to that point. And I think cooler heads will eventually prevail.
Okay, so we have some comments and questions. And by the way, those people out there, please, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and post them. And also please share with others so they have an opportunity to be able to, to watch the program. So first we have from Tim Morris. Tim from the Times-Picayune will be on our program tomorrow. He says, "Hey, Jon, can't you just solve all this by legalizing marijuana?" I think he's being a little facetious, isn't he?
We get that question a lot. I don't know if the legislature is ready to go there just now, and certainly not the special session. And I think the governor was smart not to put it in his call. That's a debate for another day. But it certainly seems to have helped in Colorado, at least on the revenue side.
Sure. Okay, so we have another comment here, Tim Allen Matthews. Does anyone understand that only government can just increase a budget or spend money without consequence? How come when government makes a bad choice or spends unwisely that it falls on the people? When a business makes a bad choice, it gets rid of programs, changes its structure, etc. I don't know. I know you don't want a budget debate, but that's exactly what this is. That's government responsibility. One more sentence. If you screw up a budget, then tell the people, lighten the belt for a bit, fix it by yourself. I mean, that seems to be the consensus among the people in Louisiana.
I mean, I understand people want to keep debating the budget. But we had the budget debate. The budget debate started in January when the governor released his executive budget. There were many, many hours of hearings and testimony on the budget in the House Appropriations Committee, on the House floor, in the Senate Finance Committee, on the Senate floor. That was during the regular session. Then we had a special session that just concluded where we repeated that budget debate. So we have had a long debate about the budget and the priorities of this state in the budget. And it's a different budget than the budget for the current year. There are changes, there are cuts, but the legislature finally, after 3 different sessions and almost 6 months, has spoken on the budget. It's in law. The governor signed it. You can look it up. It's online for everybody to look at. Those are the priorities of the state as decided by the people's elected representatives. The problem is that they left this below the line section of stuff that they didn't have enough money to fund, but they expressed again, in the budget, the people's elected representatives said, these are the things we want to fund if we have 507 million. It's actually 526 million, I think is the number in there. This is what we want to fund if the revenue becomes available. So the below the line section is also an expression of the legislature's will as it relates to the budget. The problem, of course, the core issue here is that it takes a majority vote to pass a budget, but it takes a 2/3 majority of both House and Senate to pass the revenue. So that's why we have this weird situation where we have a budget, but we just don't have enough money to fund what's in the budget, to fund the priorities of the state.
And so I think what Tim Allen Matthews was referring to, and I see that he does make a comment that I was going to actually bring up. I think he's combining the revenues and the appropriations into the nominal budget, and I think what he was really referring to was the revenues and saying, hey, look, you know, we should not be raising these revenues because we just can't afford it. I think that's he says, how can a budget be approved without knowing exactly where the money comes from? And so I understand what you're saying. Well, you know, this is what we anticipate at the very most. Anything less than that, then we raise revenue for that.
Well, let's talk about revenue for a second. You know, it does take a supermajority to raise revenue. You know, and this is really about the 1 cent sales tax. There are other smaller tax bills, but the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the clean penny of sales tax that was passed in 2016, and it was made temporary. And the legislature said at the time, we want to give ourselves time to do real tax reform. And the legislature created a commission to say, you know, tell us how to reform the tax code. And that commission did its job, and they delivered a report, and the legislature said, no, we don't really like this. And what the people who were against reform in 2017 said were, oh, well, none of our constituents are complaining about the clean penny. Nobody's complaining about the extra penny of sales tax, so I don't see the reason why we should do this complicated tax reform that you know, is going to shake things up. Let's just stick with the status quo. So they punted to this year. This year, you know, we hear a lot about the caucus of no, who I like to call the freeloader caucus, because they want the things that government pays for, they're just not willing to pay for it. But when you look at the numbers, 85 out of 105 House members, a clear supermajority, voted for at least $400 million in taxes. They didn't always agree which taxes, which is why we're here having this conversation today. But a supermajority, there's this tiny little minority, you know, a faction of the Republicans and one Democrat who just refused to vote for any extension of the sales tax. But the vast majority of House members are in favor of extending at least part of the sales tax. 32 out of 39 senators are on record as supporting at least a half a penny of sales tax. So there is broad agreement among legislators, except for this, you know, freeloader group, that we need to raise some revenue. The difference between the Lance Harris version and the Walt Leger version of sales tax, between a third of a penny and a half a penny, boils down to 17 cents on $100. I'm not a fan of the sales tax, but I submit to you that nobody is going to notice 17 cents on a $100 purchase. That is not going to wreck a single family's budget. That is not something any of us are going to really notice in our day-to-day lives. But that's the difference between having a fully funded TOPS program and having you know, a functioning criminal justice system, and having money for foster kids and food assistance and all of the social services that the Department of Children and Family Services provide. So this money is really important, but when you look at it on what does it affect you and I and everybody else who pays sales tax, the difference between the House and Senate and the two competing visions in the House is really very picayune.
So 17 cents on $100, I mean, that seems to be really, really minuscule. But at the same time, there are people who just say, look, the government is managed so badly. So, I mean, I don't care if it's 17 cents or $17. I mean, we need to manage government better. But you're saying that's not even an argument at this point in time. That's not even an issue at this point in time. Right? Yeah.
You should always try to manage government better. I don't think you know, government, just like any private organization, should always strive to improve. And I'm not in any way arguing that government can't improve its performance. I'm sure every state agency, every program could operate more efficiently, but we shouldn't. But the way to say, you're not going to become more efficient by starving them. What you're doing when you starve them, then all you're doing is hurting the people who depend on services. And so again, I'm very glad that healthcare is kind of off the table in this. But most of what government does is write checks to in the case of Medicaid, to private doctors, private hospitals, private providers of healthcare services. That's a huge chunk of it. The other big chunk is supporting teachers, administrators, and the people who teach our children in the public schools. And that money is in the Constitution, and that is going to be not adequately funded, but fully funded by today's definition.
Do you know whether or not the universities have come out with I guess their drop dead budget? In other words, to say, okay, fine, if we don't get that extra difference between the 1/3 and half, this is what's going to happen. Here's our game plan. Have they come up with that?
I don't think they've said this is what we fund at specific funding levels. I think the universities are very clear that this is this current year that we're in is the first time in a decade that they weren't cut, that they were able to kind of keep operating at current levels. And I think that's all they're asking for this time. They're not asking for more money. They're not asking for, build us a new building and let us add 10 new majors. They're saying, let us keep what we have. And keep in mind, this is in an operating environment where costs like retirement, deferred maintenance, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff on every campus that's not getting funded and that they have to absorb year by year. So we're not saying that we're going to increase their budget, but I think the main thing that they want is stability. And I think when they're out there recruiting faculty against other universities, I mean, during the Great Recession, and in the years immediately following the Great Recession, every state was cutting back on higher education. And so Louisiana was not alone. The problem is the recession ended, the economy started growing, other states started reinvesting in higher education. Louisiana kept on cutting. And that's when, that's when things really got bad. So I think when we're out there, competing in a global marketplace for the best students, the best faculty, the best talent, if you bring your university funding to the brink every single spring, like we seem intent on doing here in Louisiana, it sends a message to students, to faculty, to people around the world that Louisiana just doesn't care that much about higher education. I think that's a bad message to send. So the question is not, can LSU get by on 10% less funding or 5% less funding? I think the real question we should be asking is, can we stop the bleeding and get these universities to a place where they have some predictability in their budget from year to year?
It would seem to me that if voters knew exactly, and I know it's kind of difficult to do, but if voters knew exactly that, say, UNO would lose these number of teachers, LSU, Baton Rouge, etc., that in that kind of situation, you can articulate what you can expect to happen. Otherwise, it's just really vague. Okay, 10%, 5%, less maintenance, etc.
Well, I think you're going to see, I would be surprised when the session starts a week from today that if you didn't see higher education officials, system officials at the legislature every day telling legislators exactly this. And if you pay attention to social media, there's already a lot of that out there. So I think that the campuses have been extremely active in advocating for their budgets and letting legislators know. And again, I don't think most legislators, I mean, there are some who think, maybe we should close the campus here and there. They always want to close the campus that's not in their backyard.
Right.
They
Sure.
want to close somebody else's campus. But I don't think most legislators ran for office trying to eviscerate higher education. Just like I don't think anybody ran for office trying to cut law enforcement, saying we shouldn't fund district attorneys and sheriffs. But that's the situation we're in if they don't agree to a half a penny or some other mechanism that gets us to $507 million.
Tim Morris asked, is there any hope for real tax reform next year, a huge election year for the state?
I think in this environment, it's going to be tough to get 70 votes in an election year for anything that fundamentally changes the tax system. We're certainly going to be advocating for that. Next year's a fiscal session, of course. So, they can discuss tax matters without having to go into special session. But again, it is also an election year when people tend to get a little bit more cautious. So it'll be very interesting. But I think certainly if we don't get tax reform next year, nobody on the left, center, or right thinks that the tax code we have right now is the best one for the state. So this problem is not going to go away, and this is going to come up in 2020, 2021, and beyond until there's some kind of permanent fix. Because I think everybody agrees that what we have now is just not efficient. Maybe that's a constitutional convention. That's an entirely separate conversation. I think there's a lot you can do without opening up the state constitution. But I think there is consensus that the code we have right now is not the best way to move Louisiana and make Louisiana more competitive.
Right, and in terms of competition, Lynn Matthews says that basically businesses or the state can't compete if you don't have the money. You don't have the money because the business environment is horrible. In other words, things are bad, but if we add more sales tax or maintain the high sales tax, business is just going to continue to be bad.
Well, there's a lot more to the business environment than just the tax rates. Businesses need to recruit talented workers. Communities need strong transportation, strong schools. We can never get an accurate measure. I mean, it's impossible to measure how many businesses chose not to locate in Louisiana because of the roads and the schools and the infrastructure and the general education of our population, our crime rate, all these other things, our public health, our pollution. There's many factors. And I also think, so much of the fact that, you hear so much about how do we recruit companies to come here from other states. The vast majority of jobs don't come from somebody moving their factory from point A to point B or a company moving to Louisiana. It comes from people starting businesses where they live. And that's why education and these other investments are so important. Every time that somebody with an education from a strong degree from LSU or Tulane or UNO or somewhere else decides to move to Houston or Atlanta or Washington, D.C. or beyond, that is somebody who potentially could have started a company that potentially could have hired people, but they chose to take their talents to another state. So I think that's why it's so important to keep investing in education, infrastructure, and other things, and kind of creating the conditions where people want to move here, live here, stay here. And again, not everybody's going to start a business, not everybody's an entrepreneur, but some people will. And I think that's, so it's really about two visions of how do you grow the economy. It's do you invest in people and communities, or do you simply try to make the taxes as low as possible and you hope that somebody comes in and puts a factory here? I'm not saying that tax rates aren't important. We're a fiscal policy organization. That's what we do. But we are saying it's not the only thing. And I think there's probably been a little too much focus on just making life as easy as possible for large multinational corporations, when we really should have been asking this question about how do we make our communities better for the people who live there.
It seems to me that the basic issue is chicken or which came first, chicken or the egg. I mean, do you build the infrastructure and hope that business will come, or do you make the state as business friendly as possible based on reducing the tax load and hoping that the infrastructure gets built and hoping that the business come? I know that we just had a situation here in New Orleans where what I consider is, I'm very involved with the technology community. I came up with the idea of the digital media law, and so and really pushed that for about 8 years. Basically, we just lost a major convention, the Collision Convention, who are now going to Toronto. Why? Because Toronto has all these major companies from Microsoft to Google who have some type of major presence there in Toronto. In addition to that, the universities there are much more plentiful and more respected, I believe. And lastly, the technology community is, in terms of startups, are very, very insignificant compared to elsewhere, in this case Toronto. So I mean, it's a case in point. So what do you do to just now after 3 years, you've just lost the number one technology company organization, number one technology convention that we've had in many a year.
And I think that's an interesting question. I mean, it's a shame when Louisiana loses convention business, because
Right.
that's really is such a huge part of the New Orleans economy. I mean, I think New Orleans competes with Las Vegas and Chicago and places like that when it comes to convention business, where it's a convention town, it's a tourist town. But I think, to this other question, you don't become Toronto overnight. You don't become Toronto in 10 years. Toronto's a much bigger city. They have a lot bigger head start. But for example, I mean, I grew up in Pittsburgh in the 70s and early 80s, when Pittsburgh was a steel town that was dying, and the steel industry was dying. And they started investing in high tech and education and medicine, medical research. And it took 35, 40 years, but Pittsburgh today is a lot cleaner. It's a little bit smaller, but it's a much more prosperous, and I would say by most aspects of quality of life, much better city than it was in the early 1980s. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened because there was this kind of a civic dialogue and decades of commitment to changing the face of the city and adapting to a new economy. And so I think those are the things. And so now I think you have a place. I'm part of the generation that left Pittsburgh because there was an opportunity there, but I found my opportunity elsewhere. I ended up in Louisiana. So, but I think that the same thing is true. So, but those things, again, it's not as simple as passing a tax bill and having somebody move in. It really is about long-term civic commitment, civic investments in the things that in creating the conditions that make people want to live there, move there, and stay there.
So one last question, and that is that, so the session starts what, the 19th? Am I correct?
The 18th, a week from today.
Okay, okay, fine. So is it fair to say that it's set for what, 10 days?
Yeah, they have to finish no later than the 27th. So
Okay.
It starts a week from Monday, and then they can go through the following Wednesday.
Is it fair to say that maybe the compromising is taking place right now, and that maybe the session might be a day or two? I mean, have you heard anything about that?
It's not going to be. I mean, it takes a certain amount of. It takes 5 days to get a bill all the way through the process.
Okay.
So it's not going to be a day or two, but if they can get the House to undo its logjam, and we should know very quickly, because the place where tax bills traditionally go to die is the House Ways and Means Committee. If a tax bill gets out of there and gets off the House floor, then I think you're going to see very smooth sailing, and you're going to get this done very quickly.
Sure.
And I think, again, once this is a very different session than the special session that just ended, because there is no budget debate, and because they cannot pick and choose which items to fund. It's all on a pro rata basis. And I think once the reality sets in that every dollar that you fall short of 507 million is a dollar that comes out of sheriffs, district attorneys, TOPS, higher education, things that I think legislators in both parties care about. Once that reality sets in, I think this bill, and it's only going to be a bill or two, it's going to be a very limited number of instruments. I just have to think that cooler heads will prevail. And as angry as some people are over the outcome, and I know there are people who are angry over the budget, and there's, anger and recriminations on both sides, and people are angry about the vetoes and the construction budget. But once people put their emotions aside, and hopefully they will, we're going to get a tax bill, and we're going to fund the priorities that the legislature outlined in its budget.
Okay, well, that takes us to the end. Jon Moller, listen, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you being with us today. Tomorrow we're going to be hearing from Tim Morrison of Times-Picayune. Wednesday and Thursday we have guests, and as well as Friday. So we have a full week. A lot going on, really a lot going on. Thank you so much. And those people, again, Lynn Matthews, thank you for sharing. And those people watching now and later, please go ahead and share and like, and hopefully we'll have you back again before the fireworks are over. Jon, I really do appreciate it.
Here and watching it, and I appreciate you doing these and getting the word out and helping people stay informed. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on.
Thank you so much. And if you could just hold on one second, I'm going to hit a couple buttons and